What's up, everybody? Ben here again. Today we're going to talk about tires, sand tires. Just so happens I've got this opportunity here where I've got 4 side-by-sides in my shop with sand tires on, and I wanted to talk about them. I get tons of questions about sand tires. Various sizes, shapes, power levels, different machines. There's all kinds of variables there, different brands of sand tires, and lots of different designs and architecture for sand tires in general, for UTVs and side-by-sides. So I have a variety of sand tires on a variety of cars in my shop, and I thought it was just a good opportunity to talk about them. Quick overview. I have a 2020 YXZ 1000. It's turbo with only about 7 pounds, so it's not a lot of power, but it's a little power. And this one has Sand Tires Unlimited, STU Razorbacks in the front, and STU Paddler tracks in the back. And then I have a very similar car, YXZ 1000 turbo boost with about 7 pounds on it. And I have SS 360s in the front and SS 360s in the back. So the brand name is System 3 Off-Road for those tires. And then I have a Can-Am X3 with STU Tributes in the front and STU Blackbirds in the back. This car has something like it's got an Evo boost kit, an Evo tune, and parts on it. I think it's somewhere around 180 horsepower to the wheel, which is a little more than my YXZs. My YXZs are probably closer to 150 to the wheel. And then I have this R-Max, which is a naturally aspirated, kind of a hybrid utility that's a little bit sporty, that has STU desert tracks on it. Okay, so first of all, the brands. I do not have any Sandcraft tires here, which is a major UTV sand tire brand, and I do not have any Scat Tracks. So Scat Tracks and Sandcrafts are kind of related because they use, because Sandcraft uses Scat Track paddles to glue onto Sandcraft's carcasses. But I'm not going to get into those because I don't have any here. But those are great tires for sand, and I recommend you look into them as an option. In this shop, I have 3 cars with Sand Tires Unlimited. The short term there, of course, is STU. And Sand Tires Unlimited has been around for decades in sand cars. They do a whole lot of, back in the day, they started with VW buggies and stuff like that, and they made tires way back when. So they've got a variety, and I think they're kind of confusing on their sizing and their names, but that's why I'm wanting to explain it a little bit. And then other than Sand Tires Unlimited in this shop, I have these System 3 Off-Road, which is a different brand and obviously a very different type of tire. All right, so starting with the STUs. The YXZ I have here, this has Paddler tracks. So if you go to their website, and they recently redid their website, which they desperately needed, Paddler tracks come in a variety of different sizes. And it's interesting to point out that the sizing for Paddler tracks is different. So these are called 1315s. So all Paddler tracks, well, not all that I'm going to talk about are 15-inch wheels. So that's what this 15 means on the side. Now the 13.00, we commonly call this a 1300. And what that means is that's how wide the tire is. That's how wide the paddle is, or the blade. Or the cups. Some people call those cups. I call them paddles. So a 1300, and there's nothing anywhere on this tire that talks about what the diameter is, which is unusual because most of the other tires do. But Paddler tracks, for some reason, nobody ever talks about the diameter. On paper and on their website and in verbal descriptions, they call this a 30-inch tire. but it depends, of course, on your pressure and on your wheel width. But they are taller than that in most cases. So Padla tracks are available in a 1300. That's what we call them. That just means 13 inches wide. And then they make a 1300 plus. I don't know why they don't call it a 14, but it's 14. That's all there is to it. It's wider. And one way to tell is, of course, the side. It says 1300, and then it'll have the word plus. It doesn't have a plus sign. It has the word plus. And what they do, the only way to tell is, see here closely, there's one line. There's a mold line down the center of this tire. A 1300 plus will have two. It'll have two mold lines, where like in their mold, they add this little ring in the middle or something that makes it just an inch wider. So there's two ribs down the middle where they add about an inch down the center of their mold. And they call that a 1300 plus. So Padla tracks also come in, I think they make them in 1450s, but I didn't see them on their website. And then I know they make them in 1650s also. So those are huge tires, and that's what most of the drag racers run. Because the Padla track is a lightweight tire for the most part, and it has paddle options. The way STU does their paddle tires is they're molded with 32 paddles. So when they're molded, there's a paddle here and here and here. And then whenever you order the tire, you order, so it'd be confusing, but here's the way it works. Padla track 1315, and then you get to choose your blade. So these would be Padla track number 2. See, there's a 2 written there. It's kind of worn off. And whenever they do the mold, there's another paddle here, every other paddle, but it says number 1. And it's a slightly shorter tire, slightly shorter paddle. I think it's a 1/4 inch difference. And so what they do when you order 1 or 2 in the size that you want, and they cut off every other paddle that you don't want. And then there's an option for having comp cut or race cut. And I order all my tires that way whenever I buy them. And that's where you see this additional chunk taken out. That's why you can see the actual bands in this tire. These are comp cut pretty deep. I've had these a long time and they're worn quite a bit. But having comp cut or race cut tires is very popular in, any of the big power cars. They certainly do it. But it takes a molded tire and really lightens it up quite a bit. It's measured in several pounds, like 5 to 10 pounds a tire, depending on what tire we're talking about. But I believe these were something like 8 pounds lighter, maybe even 10 pounds lighter by being comp cut. So that's different than cutting off every other paddle. Comp cut takes more out of the carcass. So I comp cut as much as I can. I think it's a great idea. You lose durability and you lose some additional thickness of your tire. But as long as you're riding in sand, you're fine. If you ride in sandy trails that have logs or potential obstacles or rocks and stuff like that occasionally, I probably wouldn't recommend it. But if you're in dunes, you can comp cut and you will be just fine, barring running over, having an accident or running over like some debris that's in the sand. But I highly recommend comp cutting. Your tire place, your dealer probably offers it, and I'm sure they charge for it. I order as many tires as I can from Duneland. I have worked with them a couple of times now, and I think 3 or 4 sets I've bought from them, and I like doing business with them. They're good, and they will do comp cuts in all kinds of different configurations. They get creative with it, and I'll get to that more here in a minute. So, okay, to move on. This is STU, Sand Tires Unlimited, Padla Track 1300, number 2 paddle with comp cut. That's what I got here. For this power level, this car is only putting down about 150 horsepower to the wheels. So all you that ride the spec sheets from your manufacturers, yes, I know the new Can-Ams are 195 horsepower, but that's not to the wheels. It's really more like, 170 or 160 to the wheels. So, to the wheels, this car is 150. It might even be a little less. I don't know. I don't care. The point is, it's not a real fast car, and this is way too much tire for that. This tire should be supporting a car with about 200 horsepower to the wheels. Okay, I'm not going to get into front tires yet. I'm going to move on to this other set of STUs. These are called SR31 Blackbirds. So same manufacturer, Sand Tires Unlimited, same general idea. It is a molded tire. They mold it with multiple paddles on it, and then they cut off the paddles you don't want. It's called an SR31-15. So this is different than the Padlet tracks. As far as the naming goes, the SR I think is just something that's cool that they put on there. 31 is actually the diameter. So this tire is supposedly taller than the Padlet track line, but SR31s are not available in wider models. They're all the same width, and I don't know how wide they are. I think they're probably about the same, 13 or 14 inches wide. But it's interesting that they don't label that on their tires. So the Padlet tracks say 1300, but that's the width. This one says SR31, but that's the height. And then they both fit on 15-inch wheels in this case. So they do make others for 14. They make a lot of 17s and stuff like that. That's for buggies. But anyways, so the SR31 Blackbird is it's kind of one of their newer designs. I started seeing these a few years ago. Also, something else to note is you have 3 paddle options on the SR31. So these are number 2 paddle. Same deal. See, they cut off the paddles that you're not using. So the SR31 Blackbird 2 is what this one is. But whenever they mold this, there's a paddle here that would be number 2 or number 1, and then there's a number 3. And so they cut them off, whichever ones you don't want. And again, I opted for additional cutting to the carcass, so comp cutting, and that's where they went in even deeper. So, again, to save weight. So the SR31 has a different kind of paddle profile. To me, the tires look a little more square. They have kind of a different shape to the shoulder of the paddle. I'm sure there's more insight they can give you on that. And then the height options, the number 1, the number 2, and the number 3 vary from what the number 1 and the number 2 are on the Padlet tracks. So it's quite a bit different profile and the different height options. And the tire is labeled as a taller tire. And I think it is. It's barely taller. It says SR31. They're called 31-inch tires, but these things haven't measured it, but they are 32 inches tall in my experience. They're as tall as 32-inch Sandcrafts, and which is why I chose them for this X3. I needed the extra diameter. I didn't want to go with a smaller tire, so because this car originally had Sandcraft Demons on it, so I wanted to try these SR31s Blackbirds. I'm happy with them. Like most STUs, they hook extremely well on the bottom end. So they scoop a lot of sand. They really dig, and if you got a lot of horsepower and you dump the clutch, or in this case, hit the gas because it's a golf cart, then you can expect those things to move a lot of sand. They really do dig in and shovel sand. And the problem with that is your clutching has to be dead on whenever you're talking about a belt-driven car like this one. And then also your top end struggles on any type of clutch car. Like so it's on my Yamaha YXZs also. Blackbirds and STUs in general, like the Padlet tracks also. They're big paddles, they're wide paddles, and they scoop a lot of sand. And it's hard to turn that at a really high speed. So if you're drag racing like in Glamis or someplace where you have wide open sand and you actually hit high gears, or high speeds. So Yamaha's at Little Sahara, I barely get in a third gear before we shut it down. So we're only going 60 miles an hour or something like that. Whereas at Glamis, the flat drags, the sand cars go 150 miles an hour there. So the side-by-sides, of course, don't reach that speed. But my point is you kind of lose some top end because it's so much drag for that much paddle to be turning at, let's say, 80 miles an hour. You know, so lots of side-by-sides can hit 80, even in the sand. So there's pros and cons. For this car, I liked the Sandcrafts better for the power level that it is, the clutching that it is, and where I ride, which is primarily Little Sahara, Oklahoma. I liked the Sandcrafts better. It's just different. It's a car thing, you know, because I still prefer paddler tracks on my YXZs. I think STU is a better fit. Okay, so next step here, or the next tire I have to talk about for Sand Tires Unlimited. This is a very unique tire. It's been around a really long time, but it's called Desert Track. You don't see these very often. I picked these up used from a legend in the YXZ world, a guy named Jeff. He lives in the Phoenix area. I think he lives in, I don't know. I forget the specific town, but you know, there's 30 towns around Phoenix. But I went and saw him. He posted these online, and I picked them up. And I kind of had an idea that I was going to put them on my R-Max one day. I really didn't know for sure, but he was asking a reasonable price, and they look pretty new. So I picked them up from him. They weren't really worn or cut or anything. So these are Desert Tracks. The Desert Track is available in a couple of different widths, and they are 15-inch wheel, and they are considered a 30-inch diameter tire. And I believe they are. I don't think they're any taller than that. I think Paddler Tracks are taller than 30-inch. I think Desert Tracks are right on 30-inch. You can look at these two tires side by side in the back. They are both, on paper, they're both called 30-inch tires. I'll talk about the height here in a minute because the carcass versus the paddle is two different measurements. So the Desert Track, as you can see here, it's kind of it's STU's version, I think, of the small, kind of like those SS360s, or back in the day they had four snows, I think is what they call. So Desert Track is kind of STU's version of the lots of little paddles design. I don't know how many there are, but there's a lot. There might be 32. I've never counted. There might be 24, whatever. There's a lot of little paddles. And on the 14.5, so 1450s, that's how wide it is. So it's a 30-inch tall tire, 15-inch wheel, and it's 14.5 inches wide. So on this version of the tire, the 1450, it has this other row in the middle, and they just kind of block it out with a cross piece to fill that paddle. I like this design because you don't wear out your paddles very much because the carcass never really hits the ground. You're always riding on that rib down the middle, which is nice as far as wear and tear on your paddles. They'll last a long time. Another thing I'll note is these are not comp cut. So this is just the raw molded tire straight out of their mold, the way that STU manufactures them. And they are not, you know, every other paddle isn't cut off. Every other paddle isn't cut off like it is on these Paddler Tracks or on the Blackbirds, where every third paddle is cut off or whatever. This is the way they come out of the mold, and that's it. I like them. I think they're nice. They work well for this car. This is a pretty low power car. It's naturally aspirated, and it's big and heavy. I ride it in 4-wheel drive most of the time. So now I'm going to move on to the fronts. The Desert Track has a 1450 in the back and then a 12-inch version in the front. So these are actually cut a little bit. First of all, you'll notice it still has the center rib, but it does not have that double row that gives it that extra width on the rear. But the paddle shoulder is cut off a little bit. You'll see that. So it's important to note here that this is not the way it comes, but this is an example of somebody getting creative with the way they cut their paddles. You don't have to cut off every other paddle and leave it like that. Some people stagger, where they'll cut off like the corner of every other paddle on, and they'll kind of they'll toggle back and forth on that. There's all kinds of cool ways to cut, and people that have been doing it for a long time spend a lot of time on different machines, different power levels, and different applications with the shape that they cut the paddles or the carcass, and the paddles that they keep and stuff like that, and the heights and whatnot. So it's really neat. I think it's fascinating because somebody has spent a lot of time really digging into it. So here on these desert tracks, just kind of the shoulders are cut off of the paddles, because these paddles were molded at the same profile as these, where they kind of have a corner on them. But the fronts are kind of, the shoulder is cut off because it's a steering tire for the most part. But when you put it in four-wheel drive, it does move some sand for you. So that's really nice. I'm really happy with these tires on this machine. I wish I had a little more diameter, but at the same time, I'm okay with it because the R-Max has a pretty tight clearance in the back by the fender. And if you ever hit a whoop, or if you ever taken a transition at the bottom of a dune, that tire really compresses up in there because the suspension travel might actually make the tire might make contact. So I'm happy with it as far as physically fitting on the car. I do wish I had slightly more diameter on this car. But that's just kind of the nature of where we're at nowadays. Okay, I'm going to stay on the subject of STUs. I'm going to just continue talking about the fronts. So Sand Tires Unlimited Razorback. So here the names flip-flop again. It's kind of weird. So this is an 850-15. So the Razorback, I think, comes in a couple of different sizes, but this is the 15-inch Razorback. It is not cut in any form or fashion. This is the way it comes out of the mold. And it has these three ribs where it's just kind of a steering tire. You know, it floats on the carcass, you know, it floats in the sand, but then that, I call them rudder, that rib, you know, cuts in and corners pretty well. So this is my favorite type of sand tire setup. I like big paddles scooping in the back, and I like a ribbed tire in the front steering for me. I do not drive this car in four-wheel drive though. I might occasionally put it in four-wheel drive if I'm getting stuck, or if I'm in a trail that's kind of tight and you need steering response. They will help turn you around corners and stuff like that. But this is not necessarily a four-wheel drive designed tire. This tire was designed decades ago for VW buggies in mind, or something like that. It is called 32 inches tall. So on paper, or on the website, the Paddler track in the back is a 30-inch tall tire. The Razorback in the front is a 32-inch tall tire. But here, sitting in the shop, it actually looks like the Paddler track in the back is taller. So the diameters and the sizing, of course, it varies on pressure, weight, and the wheel that they're on. But point is the diameters are kind of to be taken with a grain of salt. There's so many variables. Okay, and this other front, this is a Tribute 31-inch. So the Tribute is kind of a new tire as far as I know. I saw them a few years ago start making a splash whenever the SR31s came out. The Tribute and the SR31s are a match. They are designed to work together as far as their sizing goes. So this is a 31-inch tire. It actually measures out, I think, closer to a 32, 15-inch wheel. And the width, I think this one is an 8.5 inch wide. But since STU's tires or sizing labels are inconsistent, it only says 31-15, so that's the diameter, 31, and that's the wheel width, height, or wheel diameter, which is 15. It doesn't say anything about the width on the tire, but I think this is an 850 or an 8.5 inch wide. That being said, I think it's wider than that. It might be closer to a 10, but we all know that varies with the wheel width. So, point is the Tribute and the SR31 are, I guess you could call that the Tribute and the Blackbird are designed as a matched pair. I think they work well together. These are comp cut. So the Tribute only comes with the paddles that you see here. I think it's 16 paddles. It does not come with number 1 or number 2 or number 3 heights. They're all the same paddle. You just have the option to race cut them or not. And so these are comp cut or race cut on the inside. So it's an interesting design in that you have a ribbed steering rudder, if you will, and then you also have paddles, and the paddles are on the inside of the tire. I think that's cool. It makes sense to me because to me, when you turn, you kind of cut in and your outside is kind of catching with the steering. But then if you ever need to be in four-wheel drive, it really helps scoop and move for you. So I think it's a brilliant design. They do hook very well. That being said, these are less popular than some other fronts, but I'm happy with them. I like them. There are different ways to cut them. I've seen Duneland cut them in a few different patterns. And again, it's kind of neat to see the way they cut them. But I also kind of like the idea that the outside carcass is not cut. That's still a thick wall. The inside carcass is what is cut to save weight between the paddles. So this thick wall, if you're going down like a trail that's kind of narrow, kind of makes sense that the outer wall is what is potentially going to get punctured or rubbed by a log or sticks or whatever might be on your trail. The sand trails at Little Sahara have basically trees on either side, and sometimes there's a log or a stick or something sticking out. And I like the idea that I have a full sidewall, and part of the thickest part of the tire, you know, is on the outside. That's arguably the most likely place to rub an obstacle. So I like that design, and I think it makes a lot of sense. They are heavier than like just a smooth front, but anyways, that's that. I have another set of STUs that I sold with my first YXZ. It's a 2016 that I had smoothies on the front that are 30-inch, and I had 1300 pluses on the back that are called 30s, but they were bigger than that. They were more like a 32 or 31. It looked very similar to this car. It was blue with polished wheels that were not beadlocks. It was much more of a drag type car. It did not have four-wheel drive anymore. I sold it to Alec Ward, and he got that set of tires. But those 1300 pluses are big tires. It was appropriate for the amount of power that car was putting down. And the smoothies up front, I just don't like smoothies up front. Not for duning. For drag racing, sure. But smoothies up front are they just don't have the response. You know, you turn the steering wheel and then it's like 30 seconds later, your car decides to move for you. I just didn't like the response for duning. I loved it for drag racing because those were very, very light tires. They're very thin. So, all right. That's enough for STU. I think I kind of covered the bases of the STUs that are here. Obviously, I've not talked anything at all about these System 3 Off-Road SS360s. So different brand. System 3 Off-Road is a brand that I think is relatively new to the industry. And the model here is called an SS360. That's the model of the tire. These tires are available in various sizes, and the sizing is very normal and labeled on the sidewall, just like traditional tires that you would buy. It is measured in an imperial, so it says it's in inches on the side of your tire. It is not in, like, I guess the metric measurement on like most truck tires or car tires are. So this is a 32 by 10 by 15. They make 30-inch models, I think, that go on 14-inch wheels. And then they just started making 33-inch models as well. Various widths and paddle depths as well. So this is a 32 by 10 on a 15-inch wheel that's on the front. And then the back, this is a 32 by 12. It is slightly wider, also on 15-inch in the rear. So I bought these from Duneland, and once again, I did opt for the comp cutting or the race cutting. So on the rear tire that's wider, they basically cut out carcass. This looks like it was extremely time consuming and lots of work, but they basically sliced out a chunk of the tire between every paddle. So the paddle diameter and the paddle height and everything is the same, and none of that changed. They just, to save weight, they took chunks out of the carcass. opted for their fronts to also be comp cut, but he tried something else. This was a pretty early set from him. The guy, I think it's Scott, I forget who exactly does the cutting, but we were talking about it. He has a name for this now, and I forget what it's called, but he's come up with some other ways to cut now. But these were cut, every other paddle was sliced away. It's kind of a half paddle. So if you look at the pattern in the back compared to the pattern in the front here, this little half paddle, if you will, it was cut off on the front. So all that's there is the big main paddles. That's all that's left on the front. So it's kind of a zigzag or zipper type look. And but it made the fronts quite a bit lighter, and well, the rears too. And I'm just absolutely thrilled with the way these came out. It is a different type of sand tire. It is not designed to scoop sand or to roll or to turn or anything the same way that this type of design is. So it's a completely different style of riding. People ask me, are the SS360s better? Like, do you like them better or not? And I just can't tell you that they're better or worse. I can tell you that they're different. It is a completely different style of riding. First of all, if you have this style of paddle, where I'm going to call it lots of little paddles, so like on these or on these, if you have lots of little paddles, you should really count on being in four-wheel drive most of the time. So that means you can't really drive it with the throttle, in that you're kind of oversteering or you're fishtailing or drifting like you could in two-wheel drive with cars like this. You're much more on rails. So you turn the wheel, your car turns. I mean, you kind of point and shoot type driving, rally car type driving. If you got a lot of, a sporty car with this type of tire on it. So you pretty much always have to be in four-wheel drive, even in the open dunes. I do occasionally put it in two-wheel drive, but there's just constant wheel spin. It doesn't hook up. It never really scoops sand, but you're very quickly floating. You're constantly floating on top of the sand. So you're never really digging in and scooping. You're just sliding across the top at a rapid speed. So that being said, high speed or like long trips, whenever you're more or less cruising at a particular speed, it's very efficient. And they never really dig in anywhere at any time. And I'm really happy that I did opt for the comp cutting, except for literally the first 15 minutes I drove this car with these tires. I ran over a T-post. You know, those metal fence posts that are sitting in the middle of the land. For some reason, Little Sahara, Oklahoma has this fence line that runs down the east side of the dunes. And the fence line, of course, the dunes kind of blow over it. So sometimes the fence is exposed, sometimes it's under the sand, whatever. It was night, and I was messing around on that side of the dunes. I was leading a snake of cars that night. For some reason, I thought it'd be fun to go over there. It's a little bit of trail type riding, and I thought it'd be fun to try out these cool tires in the trails and blah, blah, blah. I ran over a freaking T-post, and of course, it hit at the thinnest part of the tire, right where it was comp cut. It did not hit on a paddle, which would have been much more durable because it's thick there. So, long story short, poked my brand new tire, and I was able to plug it and get back to the sandbox, and then it still leaked. But the next day I took it to Stewart's. They were able to dismount it, plug it from the inside, and it's held there perfectly fine ever since. So, the long story short is, yes, you do sacrifice durability. That being said, if you run over a steel T-post in the middle of the sand dunes, you're probably going to get poked no matter what tire you have. So even if this was not comp cut, I'm confident it would have made a puncture. But yes, this is an example of what you kind of sacrifice whenever you comp cut. That being said, this tire is like 8 or 10 pounds lighter with that comp cutting, and that's a mega difference. One thing about comp cutting or race cutting to note is that, a lighter wheel matters. But that mass, see, it's your motor is spinning it from the axle, from the center. So that mass is more centralized. So if like your hub or your brake rotor or even your wheel is heavy, it matters less than your tire. Your tire really matters because that weight is at the ends, the height, the highest parts, the farthest part from your drive axle. So the weight out here on the end is exponentially more how do I say it, more inefficient with turning because it's the way centrifugal force works. If something is heavy at the end of your rotating mass, it's quite a bit more harder. I guess it's quite a bit more effort to turn it. So the fact that this tire is 8 or 10 pounds lighter and all that weight came from the outer circumference of your rotating mass really, really matters. So comp cutting makes a big difference. I think it makes a bigger difference than having a lighter wheel, if nothing else, just because of the fact that it's on the outermost point of your rotating mass. And I highly recommend comp cutting if you're in sandy area like dunes. If you're on sandy trails or any other type of riding, I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, that's all for this video. I did not talk about the wheels at all. Obviously, every car has different wheels on it. That's a whole nother discussion. Beadlocks, not beadlocks, widths of wheels, diameters of wheels, offsets of wheels, all that matters. And I'll probably do just a completely different video about it. I might also dismount these and weigh them individually. I've never done that, but I'm going to take the word from Duneland. So when you buy tires, I'm trying to see, when you buy tires from Duneland, they have weights written on them, and one of them's in white and one of them's in red. And these are probably all worn off, but but that's basically how much weight you lose whenever you, okay, so here's an example. So this tire, 26.5 pounds. And I think that says 19.8 pounds. So that's how much weight it lost whenever they cut it off. So it started at 26.5 pounds and then they cut off a lot of, and I think that says 19.8. Let me see if I can find another example. That one, it was there, it's worn off. I can't tell what it says. So anyways, if you buy a new set of tires from Duneland, look at those markings and you'll be able to tell how much weight you really saved. It's dramatic, it really is. And I strongly recommend it. I think they charge $100 a tire, I'm not really sure. And speaking of money, I didn't really talk about pricing. Just know that this is an expensive game. There's nothing cheap about sand sports, especially if you're talking about new side-by-sides. X3s and Razors are like well into the $30,000 range now when you're buying a new car. Yamahas are much cheaper, but you have to build them because they're a far inferior car from the stock. But anyways, aside from that, I will mention that STUs and Sandcrafts, so Sand Tires Unlimited and Sandcraft tires, are basically top of the line. They're extremely expensive for a tire, in my opinion. I will say that SS360, so System 3 SX360 tires are quite a bit cheaper. Just ballpark, they're about half the price. I don't know how that translates exactly. I'm going to say that these Blackbirds were probably $300 to $400 per tire, whereas these things are probably like, I don't know, maybe $180 per tire, something like that. I don't know for sure. I rarely get into the money of my products that I sell, but just understand that System 3 SS360s are much cheaper than Sandcraft or STU tires. Because of that, I think they're a great backup tire. I think you can get some cheap wheels, get some SS360s, put them on them, and just leave them in the trailer. If you ever puncture a tire, or if you ever go to the drag strip with these on and then you want to change to these because you're getting on the trails or something, you just have they're inexpensive, and they're good to have around, and they're a great all-around tire. You can drive, like in Little Sahara, Oklahoma, the small town of Winoka is attached to the dunes. It's nearby. So like I drive this car around town and I don't worry about my tires getting messed up. Whereas these paddles get chewed up every time you're on pavement because of, I mean, you can tell just from the wear and tear, because of the fact that that paddle is on the pavement every time. So this center rib or this type of design is far better whenever you're not on the actual sand. It's much better. So there's that. What else? One more thing I'll mention about diameters, and this is probably why STU diameters don't really match with what it looks like. So understand that when you scoop, or when this tire is sitting on sand, it floats at a different height than when it's sitting on pavement. So down here, see, if we were on sand, this paddle would just disappear. It would have no effect on the diameter of rotation, because it just sinks right into the sand. The carcass, so this part is what actually floats and rests on the sand. So because of that, the carcass of this tire is really what you're rotating, or what we call the rollout. So if you were to take this tire and roll it on the surface of the sand, and you marked the first point and the last point, on your tire, you did a full rotation. So the rollout would be significantly less in sand than it would be here on the pavement, because on the pavement, a lot of it is resting on that paddle. So even though, there's weight on it and it's kind of flattening the tire a little bit there, understand that your rollout is really different when you're in the sand. Same thing, right here, your rollout of a Razorback on pavement is going to be quite a bit different than rollout on the sand, because this rib and this rib basically sink completely into the sand, and your car actually rests on the carcass part here and here. That's where the sand is holding the weight and floating on top. Same thing with this, same thing with this. Those paddles sink right into the sand. So your rollout is different in the sand than it is on something like pavement, or even hard sand, or harder like dirt type stuff. So that's a significant difference. And when you comp cut, notice that you lose another 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch of your carcass. So what that does is it gives you a deeper paddle. Your paddle is now, instead of 1 inch, it's about 1 1/8 inches. So you're scooping more sand and your rollout is less. So comp cutting not only saves weight, but it really does change the dynamics of how your tire is rotating as well, and how much sand it's scooping. So comp cutting it's kind of got pros and cons. As long as it's matched for the amount of power that your car is putting down, then comp cutting is great. But if you have a low horsepower car, it's going to be nice to comp cut because you have less weight, but you're going to have to size your paddle right, because you're going to be scooping more sand. So there's kind of pros and cons. I would recommend, if you have a low power or kind of mid power side by side, I would recommend like a paddler track that's comp cutted, but you have the number 1 paddles, because they're shorter paddles. I think they're instead of 7/8, they're like 5/8 or something like that. Same thing with the Blackbirds. These are the number 2 paddles, but the number 1 is significantly shorter, and the number 3 is significantly higher. So it just depends on the match of power that your car is putting to the wheel. I don't really care what your car puts out of the motor. What matters is what's actually to the wheel. RPMs are a big deal as well. Like these Yamahas, they just have to have RPM to make power. They suck at low RPM, low speed. So I think one last thing I did not mention before I started this video, I put the same amount of air pressure in every one of these wheels. 16 tires in the shop, and I went through every one of them, and they all have 10 PSI from where they're sitting, front and rear. I usually run about 10 PSI in all of my tires. That's what I like. I feel like if you get to 8 or 7, As long as you have a bead lock, that's okay. But that's kind of drag race type pressures. If I know I'm gonna, if I've got a high horsepower car and I'm gonna go drag racing, I might put bleed some air out and go down to 8 psi to hook more. But for duning, I like it to be 10, maybe even a little bit higher on some of these. Maybe on these types of tires, I would go higher to 12, but just to kind of minimize your sidewall deflection. Deflection is like how if your sidewall crunches, you know what I mean? If it's soft and you hit a whoop, or you hit a transition or something and your tire compresses, that really affects the way your suspension reacts. So you don't want it to be low. You don't want 6 or 8 pounds when you're duning. That's drag race type stuff. But when you're duning, I prefer 10. Maybe I would go up for duning and down for drag racing, but 10 is kind of my all around. Okay, that's it for sand tires. I might do another video some other time about wheels, and I might do a video some other time about dirt tires. I have an obvious preference for dirt tires. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you want to see more content for this type of stuff. Bye.